when my default is to like get busy. Like if things aren't working out the way that I want them to work out, I start to move, and which is, I'm learning it's not productive. Too often, Black women are a mere afterthought in conversations around wellness, but not in this space. On this podcast, the dialogue is always centered around women like you. Welcome to the podcast, but more importantly, welcome to the tribe. Be well, sis. All right, so today I am super excited. I always say that, but I genuinely am super excited to be speaking to today's guest. She is author, educator, speaker, all of the things, Caroline J. Sumlin. How are you today?
I'm doing well, thank you. I sound a little froggy. I am getting over a head cold. This is not my normal voice, but
It sounds good.
Thank you. Sometimes I feel like Phoebe in Friends when she gets a cold and she can all of a sudden sing better. Sometimes I feel like my cold voice makes me sound a little better. And then I go back to my regular voice and I'm like, oh, right. That's my normal voice. Okay, so I'll enjoy it while it's here. But other than the fact that I'm having a little bit of a hard time breathing, so if you hear me wheeze, maybe edit that out. I'm doing well.
Oh my goodness, not wheeze.
No,
just do you have your inhaler on hand? Slow wheeze.
Don't worry about it. It's in the car. I'll be fine. Okay. It's minor.
Okay.
All right. I'm well. I'm well. Thank you so much.
Good. So, I've been in the habit, I'm trying to be in the habit of asking on the podcast, how are people doing PMS? Because we're used to just reflexively saying fine, even though you gave a really good answer. I want to know, how are you doing PMS? So physically, you already touched on, mentally and spiritually. So how are you doing in those realms? And you can go as deep or as shallow as you want to. It's up to you.
Oh, okay. So like I mentioned, physically, getting over the cold that kicked me in the butt this past weekend. So I'm just happy to be on the other side of that and getting a little bit of energy back. Mentally, I'm okay. I'm it'd be up and down. But I would say today is more up than down. So I will take that and run with that. And spiritually, I think, is something that I am constantly working on, trying to force myself to be more in tune and present with myself. I'm someone who tends to always go for distraction, whether that be, always, this is ironic, but always listening to a podcast instead of listening to my own thoughts, or having Gilmore Girls on in the background or something like that. And I'm trying to train myself to have more moments where I am listening to myself spiritually and forcing myself to ask myself, like, where are we right now? So I appreciate you asking that question, because I don't ask myself that question too often.
Of course. And honestly, that's relatable. I often have a podcast or music or something also in the background. And lately I've been actually driving like with nothing, just the sound of the wind or the AC. Just to tune it out a little bit. So I think I was overstimulating myself. There's always something going on. And also when I'm uncomfortable, I get busy. So I like overstimulate myself. So I've been trying to let me just tune out one of my senses out at a time, which is right now, usually it's going to be like the auditory. So relatable.
I'm the same exact way. Same exact way. I can relate 100%. Always tuning something out, or tuning yourself out essentially, and really tuning out those other
the outside
external factors, right? And tuning inward more, as uncomfortable as it may be.
Yeah, that's the word. I need to get used to the discomfort of whatever my thoughts are and whatever how am I truly feeling. Just sit with that and to be able to move through it.
Yes.
So I am super excited to talk about We'll All Be Free, a book that you wrote. So let's talk about the main, what led you to write We'll All Be Free? I think a lot of us talk about wanting freedom and liberation, but do we really know what does it mean to be free? So what led you to write this book?
My journey has been a little bit all over the place, and I definitely didn't think that my first book would be this book. I always knew I
Mhm.
wanted to write a book, and the underlying, or really the overarching theme, not the underlying, but the overarching theme of my book is it's really a book on worthiness. But it
Mm.
brings in um, a lot of elements that you don't see in a book on worth. It brings in the societal impact and the root, specifically in our Western slash American society, and that being white supremacy culture, and how
Mhm.
that impacts our worth, and the fact that because of how society um, really has us all, as I say, in a chokehold or in bondage. We're not free, and we don't realize that within ourselves. Um, Now, I always knew that my first book would be about worth because that's been a theme in my life, feeling
Yeah.
unworthy. I didn't know that it was going to take this specific societal, social justice, anti racist lens to it because I didn't connect those two dots for quite some time. As most of
Mhm.
us don't, we think our worthiness issues are completely self imposed or completely related to history that we've gone through, past traumas, the person that hurt us here or the thing that happened in our life
Mhm.
here. And not that those don't count, they do. And I talk about those in my book as well. But we usually separate our culture and our society,
Mhm.
even though we're literally swimming in it. And it impacts us
Yeah.
so much and it conditions our brainwaves. We completely forget about that when we think about the way that we see ourselves and how we view our worth. So when I began to do more research on the topic, but also it was kind of twofold thing happening. There was the murder of George Floyd. There was January 6th, and my my own just political and Black history and all the nerdiness things um I for my own self I just kind of was like I'm just going to do more research in this area. I'm going to
Mhm.
figure out this because I had questions for myself that I wanted to answer that I've always been wondering, and it was more so along the lines of, well, why is our culture or our society a society of white supremacy? Where did that come from? Where does this idea come from that
Mhm.
whiteness is superior? Because it was one
Mhm.
that I had essentially didn't realize it, but I had bought it into it, as a
Of
kid
course.
and even as a young adult, I
Of
had really bought
course.
into it. I was just like, that's normal. Like that white people
Yep.
are the top and we're not
They are.
because
Yep.
because,
Yep.
right? Period.
Yep.
Um, and
Mhm.
when I began doing that research, I was able to connect a dot. I discovered not just systemic white supremacy, which I kind of already knew about, but I discovered the culture of white supremacy. I discovered that research, I discovered the characteristics. I realized through that research just how connected it was to how we see ourselves, and began
Mhm.
to understand my own life so much more. My
Mhm.
struggles with perfectionism, my belief, my struggles with um, like asking for help and feeling like I have to do everything by myself, the constant chasing and hustling that no matter what I was doing in life, whether it was working, interning, being a college student, being a mom, I was always on this
Mhm.
hamster wheel of trying to prove myself. And once I
Mhm.
realized that we have this culture that that was created out of, that's birthed out of the what I call the foundation of systemic white supremacy, that created this culture of white supremacy, that made me realize, oh my gosh, all the things that I've ever believed are are made up. Excuse me.
Yeah.
I am
It's all
sick.
fake.
Still a little
It's
sick.
okay.
It's made up. It's
Mhm.
it's it's a construct. Like I really fell for this. I fell for it in all ways, in professionalism, right? In elitism,
Mhm.
in
Mhm.
capitalism. I fell for it. I,
Mhm.
I was swimming in it. I believed in it. I thought that was the way to be. And when
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
realized that was all made up and it was made up for reasons to maintain the hierarchy that is white supremacy,
Mhm.
that's when I began to
Mhm.
unlock some liberation for myself. And that's when I was like, aha, this is the angle
Mhm.
for the book. This is what this needs to be about. This is what people don't know when they're
Yeah.
searching for,
Yeah.
why can't I still feel like I'm enough?
Yeah. I was just reading on your book page. I want to skim down to one part. It said da da da. And since it was my fault, I needed to fix it. So just the constant for people who are not reading at the moment, I'll link it down below. I needed to fix it. So all of the things that we think are inherently aren't right with us. You said it was my fault. I wasn't beautiful. I wasn't as smart as I thought I should be. It was certainly my fault that I hadn't achieved what I should have achieved by now, according to society's standards. I wasn't worthy, and it was my fault. I needed to become as thin as possible, chase success, assimilate to dominate culture, to eat healthier, work out more, wake up at 5 a.m., buy 3 planners, contour my face, goes on and on and on. And I
Right.
was just thinking to myself, like, if I'm to be successful, right? So like an amazing mom who does all the things for my kids, who makes them every single organic meal, and I'm supposed to take care of my physical body and my mental health and bring in some money into this household. Where is the time? And to your point, it's like, this is not real. It
Right.
is not real. So my question for you is, we've all been conditioned to think that we need to do certain things and to play into the system to be successful. When you realize, wow, this is not real. It's all fake. Did you have like a internal crisis in a way? Because like the way you've lived your life maybe could have felt like, oh, this was maybe a waste or fake, or what was your thought process when you had the realization like, oh man, I was set up like we all are.
I've never been asked that in that way before, in internal crises. I've actually never thought about it like that. I've always just thought about that. For me, it was a little bit more of just kind of like an exhale. Like I was like, oh,
Mm.
okay. I don't,
Mm-hmm.
this doesn't make any sense. No wonder for me, it was no wonder why I can't. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Because
It's
it
not possible.
always
Mm-hmm.
trying to figure out, why can't I? Why can't I? I should be able to. I should be able to. They're doing it. They're doing it. They're doing, which by the way is also all fake. It's also made up. It's posed.
Right.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
and that doesn't just start with social media. That I have arguments for how this did not start with social media. So social media amplifies that, but you're looking at social media, or you're looking at the media, you're looking at the
Yep.
moms in church that you're comparing yourself to, whatever. It looks like
Yep.
they all doing it, right? And
Yep.
have
Yep.
justifications for why, if they can do it, you can too. And so
Yep.
you think to yourself, okay, if I have the same 24 hours, I have,
Right.
it's just all about my discipline. It's just all about planning better. It's just all
Mm-hmm.
about da, 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 da. And you continue to try and change this and tweak this and work this in, or work that and figure out, okay, right. You just kind of constantly try to put the piece of the puzzle together, and it's not fitting. The piece of the puzzle don't fit. It's never
Yep.
going to. And so when I
Mm-hmm.
realized that, for me, it was just more so just, yeah, like a big exhale, like, okay, I can slow down. But I will say
Mm-hmm.
I didn't realize that there is somewhat of a crisis as well, because I am someone who I think is naturally pretty driven. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I've been going through this internal crisis of just how I changed course when I thought I was going to be, excuse me, this,
Mm-hmm.
career woman who, had the office and the multiple six figures. And yeah, I was a mom, but I picked my kids up from school
Yep.
and, did it all in that kind of way. And I
Yes.
chose a much different lifestyle in feeling drawn towards that decolonizing and that liberation and that slowing down. And part of
Mm-hmm.
that chosen lifestyle is one where I homeschool my kids now. And
Mm-hmm.
my work is very much part time.
Mm-hmm.
And so I do find myself kind of wanting to default to this hustled, hurried, I'm
Yep.
busy, I'm productive, I'm doing work that's on my computer because that feels more meaningful. I'm, I'm writing, I'm
Yep.
producing in some way. And when I'm not, then I do have this little internal, I'm not doing enough. I'm not doing enough.
Yeah.
That pitter patter, right? Um,
Yeah.
and so having to allow myself to realize that this slowness, this slow morning we may be having, or this day where all my kids and I did was take a nature walk is
I love it.
just as worthy, just as productive. In fact, even more so because it's honoring the humanity, it's honoring the rhythm of the human
Mhm.
life that some days feel like this and some days feel like that. Even
Yeah.
honoring my feminine rhythms more than trying to operate
Mhm.
on that 24-hour masculine cycle that we are conditioned to operate on. It definitely takes a lot of rewiring in the moment because you can't
Yeah.
have. So maybe I don't think it was like this big internal crisis right away, but I think
Mhm.
as I have been putting it more into practice, even since writing the book, right? Because you're
Mhm.
also conditioned to be like, all right, well, this is going to be a success and it's going to look like this. And I'm
Mhm.
going to be busy all the time. And
Mhm.
the busier I am, or the more speaking engagements I have, or the more sales, the book sales I have, the more
Mhm.
successful I am. Right. And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
when things feel slow or you don't have
Yeah.
that, you think to yourself, oh, I'm not doing enough. I must not be enough. It automatically goes back to that. So I've been
Yeah.
having little mini, I would say,
Yeah.
crises where I have to stop, rewire. And that's part of the journey of divesting
Truly.
from the society that we have, you know, only known, the culture we've only known, I should say.
Yeah. Yeah. The reason I asked that question is because I feel like I have had a series of moments where I'm just like, the life that I'm living today is not the life that I had planned for myself. And the
Mhm.
reason is because I've learned more and I realized that basically what you said, all the things that I was conditioned and taught did not really feel good to me. In a way, I am go, 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 but it's because I felt like I always had this something on the back of my neck, like making me like hurried and pressured
Yeah.
to like achieve, achieve, achieve. And especially as I've had children and I want them to be prepared for the world, but also prepared for a better world and maybe build a better world where
Right.
we have more flexibility and my default is to like get busy. Like if things
Mhm.
aren't working out the way that I want them to work out, I start to move. And which is I'm learning it's not productive, it's just scurried energy, right?
Right. Exactly.
And but I often have these thoughts like sometimes I get mad, like I wasted so much time like with my head in the books
Mm.
and on this like pressuring myself, like I didn't allow myself really a true youth because I was always trying to get to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, the next achievement. And now that I have arrived to this age and this mindset, it's just like, well, dang, I could have really enjoyed myself. You know what I
Mm.
mean? Instead
Mhm.
of living up to all of those things, why I said that.
No, that I mean, that makes sense. And
Yeah.
I think, I hadn't actually thought of it that way. Um, and I think partly because there's a part of me that enjoys a lot of it. And I have to
Sure.
remind myself to honor that too. Like it's okay to enjoy
Yeah.
to work or it's okay to enjoy,
Hmm.
doing certain things as long as you are taking away that. But I have to overdo it and hustle with it in order to be worthy, or I have to perform at a certain level. So I do think
Hmm.
a lot of me enjoyed like being busy and doing things because I tended to gear towards work and
Hmm.
activities that actually made me feel really good. Like I wasn't out here trying to be a doctor because my mom said be a doctor and I hate being a doctor. I was okay, so I understand that. Like for me, I was like, I love journalism. I'm gonna do journalism. I'm gonna put
Yeah.
my all into journalism. So
Hmm.
I liked that. Um, so
Hmm.
I could see where that comes from. But on the other hand, I will say that I firmly believe that we are taught the lessons in life when we're ready to receive them. Right.
Hmm.
Like if we were, you know, if we have if we're looking at our past selves and we're looking at, man, I wish I knew then what I know now. But at the same time, what we didn't know then prepared us to be able to learn what we're learning now. Because I don't
It's
know how I
true.
would have been able to handle learning this information at 18, 19, 23,
That's true.
right? Um,
Yeah.
so I think that's all a part of the journey. It's all a part of the growth process. And, you know, we may have spent a decade living life like this and we don't recognize that person anymore, but that just means we get to spend the next decade living life differently and we'll continue to learn
Yeah.
more lessons. And then the next decade will look a little different. So
Yeah.
I just tend to look at
For
life
sure.
like that. I'm also not a super nostalgic person. So I will say, like, that's kind of like a disclaimer. Like, I don't tend to hang on to the past, like even with my kids, like a lot of people like look at baby pictures of their kids like, oh, I'm like, oh, cool. Like,
Mhm.
I love my kids when they're babies. I also love them now. Like, I'm fine.
Mhm.
So I,
Mhm.
take that with a grain of salt. Maybe it's just my personality, but that's the way I look at it. I think there's just beauty in we're learning what we're
Yeah.
supposed to be learning, right? We're supposed to be learning it at the age, at the season of life that we're supposed to be taking that in.
And I think that's beautiful. I think that's a really good lesson for me and for the listeners as well, because looking back may not necessarily be productive,
Right.
just sit in this moment
Hmm.
and evolve, learn as we will, for sure. So talk to me about when we say white supremacy culture, and what does that mean exactly, to those who might be new to this type of conversation, new type terminology, excuse me.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a perfect question. And I know a lot of times people hear the word white supremacy and they get the ick, or they feel like, what
Mhm.
does white people or racism have to do with, where at this point people are arguing anything, because we're in that kind of cultural climate where they're, you know, anytime you
Yep.
bring it up, it's we see the backlash. We see what happens. Even if it makes sense to bring it up, it's still we're receiving backlash. But when you talk about it in a sense of our overarching culture, people get very upset when you say, hey,
Hmm.
the culture we're living in is one of white supremacy for many reasons. And I understand that. So I try to make sure that I approach this in a way that helps people understand that it's not an attack. It's not, something where, white people are to blame for our culture or anything like that. No, no, no. But we have to understand that our society. Now, if we speak specifically about American society, and then you can also broaden that to Western society, I actually argue that it's
Mhm.
it's global, but it looks different globally. So I try to focus mainly on American and
Mm.
Western society. Um,
Mhm.
and you look at the fact that the modern society that as we know it today is something that has been building, right, over time. And we can kind of mark the beginning of that time with colonization, the genocide of
Mhm.
indigenous peoples, and the beginning of the transatlantic
Mhm.
slave trade. That
Mhm.
we can trace the formation of our society back to that in pretty much every single way. It began there. And everything that was done from that colonization in the transatlantic slave trade and all of the um, historically speaking, like the different policies, the systems, the formation of the states and everything else was done in order to maintain a very obvious racial hierarchy. This is not something that can be denied. It's
Yep.
literally right there in the original primary documents. Like, you can see very clearly that
Mhm.
our country, specifically America, um, was created to make sure that the white race was the one at the top and the black race was the one at the bottom. And then,
Mhm.
based on your proximity to whiteness or blackness, you fit somewhere along that spectrum, right?
Yep.
So when you
Mhm.
are constructing a society and you're making, your housing and your education and your work policies and your voting policies, your political systems, the way that you even design the land, and all of that is done, right, to make sure
Yep.
something specific is being achieved, then
Mhm.
what's going to happen is a culture is going to form from that. The
Mhm.
the behaviors that will, first the beliefs and the thought patterns, right,
Yep.
that then lead to the behaviors that then become
Mhm.
normal. And so when we
Mhm.
say white supremacy culture, we're talking about the fact that this is a society that was built to maintain a supremacy of whiteness. Now, people will argue, how is there a supremacy of whiteness when white people are barely even the majority anymore? We're not talking about numbers. We're talking about
Right.
a group of people that are
Mhm.
protected to maintain the majority of the power,
Mhm.
the
Mhm.
money, the resources, the
Mhm.
respect,
Mhm.
and that they are that everybody else that is not fall in line with whiteness is a subordinate to whiteness, right? So there's no denying that the society was built in that way. And so over time, as society is being built, you have cultural behaviors and like I said, thought patterns and behaviors that form from that. And that's where white supremacy culture comes from. It's this idea, same thing, but not just the systems that take place, but it's actually what follows from that, how we think about things, how we behave around things, that maintain that same idea that white people and whiteness specifically is superior. Now, that whiteness can look like Eurocentric ideas, Eurocentric schools of thought that are lauded as superior, or even just the default, the standard is another way to look at that, right? So it's not necessarily that like it's essentially the idea that anything else that's not whiteness is othered and is less than. And so what that presentation can look like, it can be, again, it can be physicality, it could be Eurocentric features when it comes to our beauty standards and our wellness and diet culture. It is the way that we will demonize foods and practices that come from people of the global majority and cultures of the global majority, but praise whiteness in wellness practices, right? And of course, if white people then co-opt something from the people of the global majority, then it becomes superior now because they have attached themselves to it, right? That's just a tangible example. It can be in the way that we view education. It can be in the way that we view the English language. It can be in the way that we view professionalism, etc. Right? And so then there was also some research that was done by a person by the name of Dr. Tema Okun, and her, along with a couple other scholars, came up with these characteristics, these traits that come out of white supremacy culture. And from that, we have perfectionism, individualism, qualified, one right way. We can go into those if you'd like. I touch on those in my book. And a lot of my content online also kind of breaks some of these down. I teach workshops on these characteristics as well. And a lot of people will see like, well, perfectionism, what do you mean? Are you saying that to act like a white person is to be perfect? Or are you saying, perfectionism isn't exclusive to white supremacy culture, because all around the world, people strive to be perfect. That's just been a thing forever. And while perfectionism can exist outside of white supremacy, of course, we see that in every culture. In our culture specifically, the way that we view what is perfect is oftentimes what aligns with the traits of whiteness. So you might see a perfect body, and you might think, well, that perfect body, if it's the lighter the better, the thinner the better, the more narrow the better, because those are the Eurocentric traits. But if it comes to like the workplace, for example, the way in which the Eurocentric kind of like ideals of what your boss or your organization might deem as like standards of practice in the workplace might be in a complete antithesis to the way another culture might do something. But because it's essentially Eurocentric in nature, that's what's deemed as like more perfect. But it's also this idea of you have to be perfect in order to be accepted. And you can bring that all the way back to the plantation, right? Zero mistakes ever. You literally have to be robotically perfect in order to not get your behind whipped that day. And that's the beginning.
It's like survival.
Exactly. So there's so many different ways that perfectionism aligns with white supremacy culture, but it's all of that coming into it. And now we have this normalized culture of must be perfect all the time, must be perfect all the time. So overall, over time, the racial, I guess, implications behind it gets a little blurred. And I think that's where people get confused. They're like, well, what does that have to do with racism now? It's not all about racism. A lot of it's about racism still, because we know that marginalized identities have to perform and more in a
Yep.
more perfect way to be accepted. We
Yep.
know that, right?
Yep.
So that's the racial
Mhm.
implication behind that and how we have to show up in the world, but also just normalizing the idea of being perfect as being a standard comes from the the
Yeah.
the development of white supremacy culture.
Yeah. You know, I was thinking about just in like corporate America, how there's like a whole other way of speaking. It's like the whole corporate lingo culture has gotten out of control. And I think if I'm mistaken, correct me please, but I feel like that is also part of white
It
supremacy
is.
culture.
Yep, you're absolutely right. Mhm.
Like all the time online, people are like, how do I say this in an email? Girl, just send the email. And
Mhm.
my short little stint in like proper corporate America and outside of healthcare and academia, I was just like, okay, these emails that I'm getting, I don't know what they're asking. It's so wordy.
Mhm.
It's not how we talk. Why do we enter these offices and institutions and now change? And for me, I feel like this is another barrier to entry and
Absolutely.
or success
Yes.
because you have to spend so much time and energy learning this new way of speaking, which is wild.
Mhm.
Like we all speak English here.
Yes.
Why are we making it more complicated?
You're absolutely correct on
Um,
especially the barrier to entry part because it's and I think I may have forgotten to touch on that. Like these characteristics, have come about as well because the idea was to ensure, right, that white people and whiteness maintain superiority. That's always the idea. So when these characteristics
mhm,
come about from those with the power to essentially, you know, inadvertently create them and to deem them standard, they're doing that to make
mhm.
sure that those that meet that standard more easily are people that look like them, and
Yeah.
those that don't are
Yep.
people that look like us. Right. So when you
Yep.
don't maybe weren't privileged to get your higher education through a master's or a PhD to be able to be versed in that professionalism speak, so to
Mhm.
speak, right? Then
Mhm.
you can be extremely qualified for a position by way of your experience, by way of your work ethic, your willingness to
Mhm.
learn something new, maybe experience that's not corporate, but it's experience in your community, your neighborhood, your family. None of that matters.
Yep.
And then especially if you
Yep.
can't articulate that in a way that is corporate lingo. Yes,
Right.
all of that is completely connected. What's going to make you look and sound more like a white person and assimilate into
Mhm.
that, not just
Mhm.
white person, but elite white male, really, assimilation,
Mhm.
cisgendered, by the way. Um,
Yeah.
and you have to hit all of that in order to be deemed good enough, worthy enough in society.
Yep. Yep. Whew. And it's no wonder why Black folk in general who are in these corporate spaces um, oftentimes are just like this is hell because
Right.
not only am I doing the job, but I have to like contort myself
Mm-hmm.
to like fit into these boxes that just aren't natural for me.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I want to talk about so when you've had the revelation, it all made sense that like the reason why you did not feel worthy enough essentially boils down to you weren't fitting into the little pegs of white supremacy culture. So you came to this realization, and now what are the steps from healing from all of those years of essentially putting yourself through it
Mm-hmm.
because white supremacy really was putting you through it.
Mm.
Um, so what was your, I guess, healing journey like as you're coming together and putting it all together?
Right. Yeah. So the first step for me, I'm a knowledge girl. I like the knowledge.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
part of the healing journey was even just writing the book because learning
Hmm.
about where this comes from was very liberating for me. Like learning the intricacies behind a big one for me. I come back to beauty and diet culture because that was a big one for me. That one, perfectionism and
Hmm.
individualism are the three. For me, that was like,
Hmm.
hard to break free from. And I've always, just ever since I could remember, have struggled with my body image, struggled with that, that belly that, you're told you're supposed to have that tone and that tightness and, the, the, um,
Yeah.
the cheekbones and the,
The
all of that.
I feel like millennials, like since we were like 8, we were on a diet.
But not even just millennials, though. I mean, when you
Mhm,
really look at the research, I
mhm,
don't remember years anymore, but I
mhm.
believe I have years in my book. Um, but some of the beginnings of where this comes from was when there were the formation of the races is really starting to take place, right? Because remember, racism was first, and then came race, and when they're really kind of
Mhm,
formulating the Caucasian race or the Caucasoid race, and then, and I'm going to say this for historical purposes only, the Negroid race was the
mm,
terminology that was used. Um,
mhm.
there and of course, what was driving that as well was Protestantism. And so within
Yep,
Protestantism and the formation of the Caucasian race was this birth, this idea of what white women needed to do in order to distinguish themselves from Black
yes,
women. And a lot of that,
yes.
I mean, there was like this, before we had like 17 and Cosmo and everything, there was this magazine called Gowie's Lady Book. Gowie, I can't remember.
Oh,
Godey, I can't remember.
mhm,
It's in my
mhm.
book. And that was some of the beginnings of teaching white women how to restrict their food. Because when you restricted your food, that showed self-control, that showed a morality to you in
Mhm,
and how if your body looked the part, then that showcased that you were number one, that you were closer to God because you were more self-controlled.
mhm,
But number
mhm,
two, that it distinguished you or from Black women who were viewed
mhm,
as fat and ugly and barbaric. Or I should say,
mhm,
fat was viewed as ugliness, because we know fatness is not ugliness, but that was what it was viewed as. And
mhm.
obviously, not all Black women were fat. As always, women have always come in all different shapes and sizes, but that was what was connected to Blackness at the
Right.
time. They connected fatness to Blackness because they wanted to
Yep.
separate. And then they attached ugliness to fatness, because, mind you, historically speaking, fatness was not always ugly. Fatness was a sign of
Right.
wealth at one point. It was
Yep.
all
Yep.
constructed, right? So it goes all the way back to that. And
Mm,
when you look historically beyond millennials, a lot of
yeah.
extremely skinny white women who were operating off
Mm,
of barbiturates and not a lot
mm,
of food because of what they were
yeah.
being conditioned to look like. So this is nothing new, but the
Mm,
heroin chic trend of the early 2000s really got our generation for
mhm,
sure. That was definitely one of the culminations of just generations of that
mhm.
of that diet culture, and that's where it comes from. But when you understand the history, and you don't, because
Yeah.
when you're born into it, you're just accept it. You're just like, oh, you walk
Yeah,
in the
this is
grocery store, you
normal.
see the magazines, and you're like, okay,
Mhm.
Jennifer Aniston looks like that, gotta look like that too, right? Or
Right. And
insert
she's the most beautiful woman in the world, right.
right
Mhm.
celebrity here. Say before social media, you're
Mhm.
watching Disney Channel, right? And you're
Mhm.
looking at Hilary
Mhm.
Duff on Lizzie McGuire, and she's the
Yep.
one that's pretty, and that's
Yep.
what she looks like. Okay, that must be what I got to do, right?
Yep.
So when you
Yep.
see where it comes from historically, that for me was one of the biggest steps for healing. And I started to unpack,
Mhm.
where does every single characteristic that I have attached myself to come from? And in my book, I
Mhm.
actually walk you through that process. I have you kind of like make a table of the characteristics that you really wrestle with. Um, and then on the next part of it, you write down, well, where does that come from? Where, like, do some
Mm.
history on it. And I encourage you, don't just use my book. There's other books out there too that will help you with this. My book does cover a lot of it, but I can't cover all of it, you know? So
Mhm.
maybe for you, again, it's individualism. Maybe it's this belief that you have to do
Mhm.
everything yourself and that you are a failure
Mhm.
if you don't. Well, where does that individualism come from? Why did we get here as a society? If it's perfectionism, if it's feeling like you have to have 18,000 degrees, whatever that might look like for you. And then
So I don't
Oh, I'm
oh, go
sorry.
ahead,
I'm sorry.
sorry.
And then the
Mhm.
last part is that you go on the right-hand side and you write down what would be the antidote to that. It could be affirmations that you're telling yourself, you know, this is a construct. I don't have to follow this. I don't have to be like this. this is what I'm allowed to do. This is what I'm allowed to be. My humanity is safe, whatever that looks like for
Mm,
you. Um,
mhm.
and so it's practicing that, understanding where it comes from, and then also
Yeah.
telling yourself, okay, but my humanity is safe. This was a construct. I don't have to fall for this anymore. Here's what I'm going to do instead. It's going to look like this instead. So every single time I feel tempted to wake up at 5 a.m. and run 5 miles because I see my body looking a certain way, or every single time I'm tempted to make sure I'm overqualifying myself for at my job, and I feel this pressure to hustle harder. I'm going to do this
Mhm,
instead. And what does that act of
mhm,
resistance look like for you? I'm done talking, I promise.
mm. No, no, I don't want you to be done talking, no. Um, I have a question. Oh, I had a question about individualism, but you just said something there that makes me think about how do we stay safe? You know, because you mentioned earlier, and we know that, especially if you're a Black woman in these corporate spaces where you do to an extent, maybe this, I need to unlearn as I say this, where you do have to overperform in order to be deemed worthy of having a seat at the table and keeping your job. How do you remain safe while you unlearn?
First of all, I want to give everyone listening the freedom to decide how that looks for them,
True. Hmm.
because you may decide, okay, I understand that this is the way it was constructed, but I still want to play the game. I still want to,
Hmm.
do it like this because I want to have job security, or I want, whatever that may look like.
Hmm.
And you have the freedom to choose that, right?
Hmm.
It may be as much as detaching your worth from it. It may be as much as realizing, okay, I can I can recognize that now my enoughness, my being allowed to be in this room or be at this table or whatever,
Okay.
is
Hmm.
already present without me having to prove
Mm.
myself. It's already there.
Yeah.
I don't have
Yeah.
to prove it as far as in my knowing. And
Yeah.
that could be all it is for you. Or you can decide, no, 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 I want to take this a step further. I do not want to perform like this anymore. I am
Yeah.
going to make sure that I am unlearning these behaviors and stopping myself from going above and beyond all the time to constantly prove that I deserve to be at
Hmm.
this table. And then there's the question of, okay, well, how do I stay safe in my job or in my, with the racism that I may face when I choose to start saying no, or choose to start doing this, or choose to start doing that. Um, and I think, of course, it's going to look a little different based on your situation. Um, I think part of it is, you know, you may have to just tell yourself, like, listen, that doesn't mean I'm stopping the excellence in the work that I'm doing. It doesn't
True.
mean that I'm going to stop that.
Hmm.
I'm going to stop, making myself available at 5 a.m. because I feel as though I need to do
Yeah.
that. But I'm going to know that my worth, my value, I'm qualified to be here. I'm going to give you excellence in the work that I do, but I'm going to
Hmm.
do that and then go home. That could be what that looks like
Yeah.
for you. It could look like,
Yeah. Boundaries.
it could look like setting those boundaries. It could look like, I'm
Hmm.
thinking of a colleague that I feel like did this really, really well, when I was a school teacher, who really knew how to play the game. But when I talked to him about it, he was very much a work smarter, not harder kind of person. He was like, listen,
Hmm.
I took like a week and I developed all these really excellent lesson plans that I
Hmm.
know are going to get me the rating that I want. And so and I've trained my students that as soon as an evaluator comes in here, we switch lesson plans if I'm
Okay.
not teaching one of those. And not that he was always doing good
Yeah.
education, but he
Yeah.
also knew, and
What they were
he would
looking
have like
for.
code word. And this was middle school, of course. So, you gotta, can't
I
do it with
love
the
it.
babies necessarily, but he would know. I mean, I guess you could just do it differently, right? Where you might switch things up a little
Hmm.
bit, and he would know
Hmm.
exactly what to do to play that game, to get that rating.
Yeah.
Okay. And his students would always just flip on a little switch. They would do their
Hmm.
turn and talks perfectly. They would hit all of the right terminology for that little 30
Yeah.
minutes. And then the
Yeah.
evaluators would leave and they would go back to doing business as usual. Now right
Right.
now, of course, as an educator's example, but my point is, he was like, listen,
Yeah.
I'm going to get my money because I
Yeah.
set myself up for success in that way, knowing I still have to play this game, knowing that as a black man, a black male educator, they're looking at me a certain way. So my point is, you have the freedom to decide what is that going to look like for you in the workplace. Because I know that's a challenge.
Mm-hmm.
You want to protect
Mm-hmm.
yourself. So it could be something
Mm-hmm.
as maybe just internal work. I'm no longer attaching this to my enoughness. I'm no longer attaching this to my worth, but I'm still choosing to play the game. It could be as far as, nope, I'm not playing the game anymore. I'm setting boundaries. My email's going off at this time. I am, not going to stress myself out over how I sound, how I respond to the email. I'm not going to play that game anymore.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
or it could be something in between,
Yeah. 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 It made me think about how I read something that stuck with me. It was like on Twitter or something. And they were like, remember that we aren't given anything, especially as Black women. So if you are at that position, at that role, you have earned that spot.
Right.
You aren't nothing. We don't get freebies.
Right.
So the fact that you're in that position, that is
That is
enough.
enough.
And to your point, learn how to work smarter. So what are the things that they value? And somebody also said that never do anything that can be repeated in a way, like things that don't add value to like the main focus of the organization. Like we should not be throwing parties, like be the party planning committee and all those accessory side things that oftentimes we are sucked into.
Right.
Figure out their values and okay, well, that's what we're going to do. So to your point, work smarter.
Right.
The last thing I want to touch on is individualism. I noticed on your blog, you had a blog post that says that individualism might be killing us.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Let's talk about it.
I do believe that. I did write that literally yesterday. Individualism I think when we talk about the characteristics of white supremacy culture, I think everyone likes to like go right to perfectionism because that's such like a recognizable one that everyone's like, oh yeah, I can see that one. Right. But individualism is one that's very difficult to see right away because it is us. It is our culture, right?
Yeah.
It was our culture is in society systemically was designed for us to be isolated. It was designed for us to feel as though and be literally the only ones doing what we're doing in many different ways, be it community wise, be it in your job, be it the way that you see and view how you handle things in life. The way that I kind of bring attention to it is twofold. One is that society conditions us that individualism is the one right way to behave as a human, in such that you are solely responsible for you and you alone. And so all of your success or all of your failure or anything in between is all up to you, that you can't, therefore you cannot blame anything or anyone else for anything that you might face. And it takes the onus off of leadership to then put policies into place that would then support and help people. Because if it's all up to you, if you want to succeed, or you want to make money, or you want to be healthy, lose weight, whatever you want to be successful in, whatever that looks like, then it's all up to you and you alone. If you just work hard enough and you just pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you by yourself alone, then you will get there. And it's no one else's responsibility to help you do that. Everyone can do it. It's just work hard enough and it'll get done. Right. So it allows for society to be like, okay, well, if you want to have children, well, you have to find a way to make the money, to have the job that will allow you to take the time off, to have to afford to do that, and to be able to afford the childcare, and to be able to afford the house, and to be able to afford the healthcare. So all the things that we as humans should have rights to, right? Things that are human rights to food, our human rights to shelter, our human rights to healthcare, our human rights to childcare, to quality education in our society are all things that you should have to work for and earn. and do that
Yeah.
by yourself. It's
Yep.
individualism in a
The
nutshell.
personal responsibility. Yeah. Yep.
Exactly, right?
I
So
oof,
because that should be by yourself, we don't need to give you universal childcare, universal
health
healthcare,
healthcare.
stipends,
Yep.
whatever that may look like. Because if
Mhm.
you can't, don't have kids if you can't afford them. I've seen that online all the time, right? It's your
Right.
personal response, and it's not to say that there's not any personal responsibility in life ever, but it completely takes away from the fact that humanity is supposed to happen in community. We cannot do
Period.
all of this by ourselves. And
Yep.
that's not what, and a government is there to support and help the community, the people. So that
Mhm.
is the result of that conditioning, all things that we've normalized. I mean, 5 years ago would have been like, yeah, don't have kids if you can't
Mhm.
afford them. I'd have been all on that
Mhm.
bandwagon, you know,
Mhm. Mhm.
and
Yeah.
positioning myself to believe that I'm morally superior because I did all the things I was supposed to do, right? Like really truly believing those things, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Because
Yep.
again, that's how society conditions us to see people that are in need, see people that need government assistance as less than, as inferior, because you didn't do it by
Mm.
yourself, right? Um,
Yeah.
so what we end up having is multiple things, everything from the the complete internal shame that we're constantly living with, feeling as though,
Mhm.
again, kind of coming back to the I should be able to, I have to push, I have to do harder, I have to work harder.
Yep.
Um,
Yep.
the fact that I couldn't do it, what's wrong with me? Why can't I?
Yep.
Ignoring the factors that are out of your control for multiple things. It could be, again, going back to
Mhm.
career wise, factors that are out of your control that make it difficult
Mhm.
for you to achieve what you want to achieve career wise, that other people may not have those barriers, but you're
Yep.
comparing yourself to somebody without those barriers, thinking that you should be able to perform at that level or achieve that thing. If that's individualism, it
Yep.
could be anything from the way that we view, bringing it back to diet and wellness culture. We immediately see someone who has a thin body and assume that they did all the right things by themselves, they're healthy,
Yeah.
and if you can't do that, that's on you and you alone. Just eat better, just work out harder, just do this.
Right.
It's all your fault if you don't look this way. So first of all, we're assuming that that's health, right? But then also
Right.
it's, again, putting that onus completely on you, completely ignoring the fact that there could be genetic conditions in place. There could be
Mhm.
um, climate things in
Food.
place. There could be
Yep.
food insecurity in place. There could be
Yep.
an inability to afford
Mhm.
afford the health insurance or the
Yeah.
dietitian or whatever that may look like to
Mhm.
allow to afford you the ability to have more control over your health, so to speak. And even if you do all of those things, you can still have
Yeah.
health
And it
problems.
goes back to Yep, and it goes back to what you just said too, like, we don't have universal health care.
Mhm.
There are neighborhoods that don't have access to, like, nutritious
Right,
foods. There
exactly.
are some neighborhoods that you can't just go out on a walk because it might be literally dangerous or the infrastructure is not there for you depending on where you live.
Exactly.
Like, all of these things that should be put in place by our government and leadership
Mhm.
is not
It's
afforded
not.
to all of
Right,
us.
exactly.
Yeah.
It goes back to, and then who is it afforded to? All in
Mhm.
order to make sure
Right.
that all of the
Yeah.
supremacy, all of the hierarchy, the power, the
Mhm.
what's looked at as the standard, the norm, the
Mhm.
superiority is usually in line
Yeah.
with those who are white.
Yeah.
So it's all of
Yeah.
that, right? And then it
Yeah.
pits us against each other too. It's you know
Truly.
the we people like to blame the current cultural climate, and current is really, I mean, it's always been like this. It's just like this more in our face because of social media. Our climate has always been very divided. Um, but we
Yeah.
like to blame, you know, people spewing hatred at each other as some sort of recent phenomenon, and all because we bring up DEI in conversations now, and white supremacy in conversations. No, this is nothing new. It's the fact that
Right.
because this is our norm, because this is our culture, that
Mhm.
that we treat each other like this. So we think, okay, well,
Yeah.
I mean, think about the student loan. When that was a huge conversation when
Yeah.
Biden was looking to pardon student loans. And so many people into talking about the fact that, well, I paid off all my student loan and I had to work 3 jobs and I did this and da 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 da. So why should you get, yours
Yeah.
pardoned or yours forgiven? That's individualism in a nutshell. The belief that
Truly.
because I did this by myself, you should have to do it by
Mm-hmm.
yourself too. You should not get help. You're just lazy. You're just,
Mm-hmm.
not working hard enough, not doing this, not right. That's
Yep.
individualism.
Yep.
So, I mean, I
Yep.
feel like I've rambled a bit with this answer because it's
No.
so complex. None of these characteristics are
Yeah.
one and done. Like it's this. It's not like
Mm-hmm.
that. It shows up in so many different ways that are
Mm-hmm.
so complex. And again, so normalized that
Mm-hmm.
unless you
Yep.
know what you're looking for, you can kind of look right past it.
Ooh, that's the truth. Ooh. And that brings us to, you guys need to buy We'll All Be Free so that you can recognize what all is stacked against me. Like, how is this involved in my life and therefore my self-esteem, my self-worth, like how I view myself and
Right.
my successes or my quote failures. Super important to be able to like discern it and then move from there. So thank you, thank you, thank you. I could talk to you for hours about this because it is so layered. So thank you for talking to us. Thank you for this book. Again, the book is going to be down below in the show notes. That way it's a quick click for you to purchase. If you cannot afford it, please call your library for them to order it.
Yes.
That way you can still read it and all of those good things.
Thank you so
Thank
much
you,
for having me.
Caroline.
This has been an honor and a pleasure and so much fun.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So grateful. Thank you for listening to this episode of Be Well Sis. If you'd like to get in touch with us, there's a link in the show notes. Be Well Sis is hosted by me, Dr. Cassandra Dunbar, and produced by Edit Audio. Don't forget to hit follow so you never miss an episode. Until next time, be well, sis.